poet, and entrepreneur, she was a relentless champion for women and child welfare. She emphasized on the progress in education and culture and was also a keen promoter of Indian arts and heritage. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation, which was founded in 1980, is an organization conceptualized on her ideology and vision. Her spirit to create a better tomorrow drives the machinery of the foundation, which embodies her timeless words, "Karm hi jeevan hai." Work is life. Almost 40 years later today, we are proud to claim that the Prabha Khaitan Foundation has risen from strength to strength and launched several initiatives to further the cause that Dr. Khaitan had envisaged. We promote Indian arts, culture, literature, and music in all our endeavors. And even our anthem, which you all heard when you walked into the hall, showcases the soul and spirit of our Indian philosophy, unity in diversity. The anthem reflects the poetic genius of Rabindranath Tagore, flowing melodiously into the folk music of Rajasthan in a pleasing fusion of Dadra and Kajri. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation strives to promote local artisans, and we endorse their products when choosing tokens of our appreciation to gift to our patrons and guests. Even today, we are delighted to be felicitating Dr. Shashi Tharoor with a beautiful Kantha Uttorio embroidered by the artisans of Bengal. And all the Bengalis will endorse that I said it right. The foundation works to create social awareness by highlighting one pressing cause every month. For instance, we have used the artist Sudipta Kundu's poignant paintings to reach out to our audiences and patrons on social media and our invites in order to create a better sensitivity across the board. This endeavor then becomes the cause of the month. This month, we are highlighting National Cancer Awareness Day through the idiom, "Don't let pain define you, let it refine you." This is an attempt to support all those who have faced the dreaded C word, either themselves or otherwise. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation's central initiative, however, is to promote literature. We always look forward to celebrating the birth of a book and rightfully have named these celebrations Kitab. Kitab provides a platform for authors to display and showcase their newest literary works before a discerning audience and the media through our tastefully curated book launches. Today, we are proud to be launching Dr. Shashi Tharoor's new book, Pride, Prejudice, and Panditri, The Essential Shashi Tharoor. In association with Aleph, and this event is presented by Shri Cement Limited. It is an exceptionally proud moment for me, and I can steal 15 seconds of this glory from you, Shashi, because exactly 5 years ago on this day, you had launched my book in Delhi after having launched it in New York. Thank you, Shashi. So while history comes full circle and you churn out one book a month, I'm still struggling to complete my fourth. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, of course, needs no introduction. The iconic literary genius, a veritable wordsmith. He's an author and a politician. A former international civil servant, he's also a seasoned parliamentarian and truly rules the literary world. Can we put our hands together for him? Joining him today is Mr. David Davidar, who is also a celebrated novelist, publisher, and editor. May I now request Dr. Shashi Tharoor to please come onto the stage. Can Shinjini Kulkarni, Ehsas woman of Noida, please come on stage to felicitate Dr. Tharoor. Thank you, Shinjini. Can I request Mr. David Davidar and Mr. Kapish Mehra of Rupa Books to please come on the stage. And will all the Ehsas women of Delhi NCR, Archana Dalmia, Anantmala Podar, Deepali Bhasin, Huma Khalil, Ina Puri, Shazia Ilmi, and Karuna Goenka please come on the stage? Will Ms. Onindita Chatterjee, Executive Trustee of Prabha Khaitan, also come on stage so we can finally formally launch the book? I need a copy. Upasna. Thank you.
It is there. Book. More books are there.
No, he wanted to give it to his mother, na? That's such a charming gesture, Shashi. Thank you, everyone. A special thanks to Anshu Mehra and Garima Mittal of Ehsas Meerut and Nidhi Garg, Ehsas woman of Bhubaneswar, who have specially come down for this launch today. Ladies and gentlemen, please do remember that we are strictly following all COVID protocol. Do maintain a requisite social distance. I didn't see any of that when you were flocking around Dr. Tharoor. Wear your masks at all times, and please keep your phones on silent. So without any further delay, over to you, Shashi, and David, the stage is yours.
We have to talk for another minute because they're busy plugging in the mics.
I haven't researched anything else to say. So while we plug in Shashi's mic, be patient for another 2 minutes, and I shall come down off stage and take my chair there. Thank you, everybody.
Is this working? No, it's not. No sound. Working now?
Okay. As all the introductions have been done, I'd like to jump right in. I'd like to thank Mrs. Dalmia for her very kind words and the Foundation for sponsoring this great event. It feels like that there might almost be light at the end of the tunnel. I don't think we're out of the woods yet, but this gives me some cheer, and I hope it gives all of you some cheer, especially because the person who's at the center of this event is someone who has been a friend for 40 years and an author I've published for nearly that long. So it's very appropriate. Shashi's star has shone brightly over 3 planets of endeavor, as we've heard: politics, international diplomacy, and writing. But of the 3, the world that the star has shone brightest over, and for the longest time, has been his writing. And so it's entirely appropriate that we're celebrating here a book that marks the culmination of the first 50 years of your writing career. Shashi has been publishing...
Not to mention 10 years of Aleph.
I'm coming to that. I mean, Shashi has been writing improbably enough. I mean, to look at him, you'd think he's about sort of 25, 35. For over 50 years, he published his first short story when he was 10 years old. And he published his first book when about 40 years ago. So this book is meant to celebrate those milestones, as well as the fact that it is the 10th anniversary of Aleph's founding. And he was one of the earliest authors to join our list and has been our most steadfast pillar of support. So thank you, and this is meant to be celebrating all these milestones. Now, the idea behind this conversation is to try and unearth some of the stories behind all the kind of selections in this book. There are over 70 selections in the book, which range from fiction to non-fiction to politics to history. And I'm going to try and unearth some of the stories behind these selections. So we will talk for about 45 minutes, after which we will throw open the evening to questions.
Yeah, I thought it was a bit, if you can just put it closer to you, just hold it in your hand.
You know, my wife said to me before I started, she said, don't mumble, don't say and keep your mic close to your mouth. So I haven't learned. Anyway, can you hear me now?
Is that better?
Is that better? All right. Okay, Shashi. As your profile as a politician has overshadowed your other achievements, I'm going to try and keep that to the minimum and look at other aspects of your, well, professional career. Let's start at the beginning. You write that you began to write very early and published your first story at the age of 10. Tell us how that came about.
Yeah, I began to write very early, I think largely because that was it. I mean, as a kid, I was asthmatic, and that meant that I was confined very often to bed, struggling to breathe, and couldn't go out and play with my friends. And of course, I grew up in an India without television, without, obviously Nintendo wasn't a gleam in an inventor's eye, computers didn't exist, let alone mobile phones. So the only distraction you had if you were a little asthmatic kid was books, was reading. Reading became my escape, my entertainment, my education. And so I read everything I could lay my hands on, but being the eldest child meant that I didn't have any elder brothers or sisters' books to borrow, so I read rather precociously whatever was in my father's and mother's collection at home. To while away the rest of the time, I had two activities that both involved books. One was playing book cricket, which is a sport that sadly has gone out of fashion. It involves taking the fattest book you can find in your parents' shelves, making up imaginary cricket teams, and opening pages at random to tot up the scores. It actually can keep you diverted for a while if you're as much of a cricket nut as I was. And the second thing I did was to write. And what I wrote, obviously, was very derivative of what I was reading. So I had grown up reading all these typical English books of children's stories. Enid Blyton was a favorite. My mother started me off by reading noddy tales of adventures of this little doll in Toyland from when I was a tiny tot. And then, of course, I graduated to the adventures of various kids trying to solve mysteries and so on. So I was reading all of that and trying to write stories like that. So I invented the 6 solvers, rather like the famous 5 or the 5 find-outers of Enid Blyton. Except my solvers were going off, like me and my sisters, to a Kerala village every year for holidays and solving mysteries there. But that was the sort of thing. And then, as I became a little older, I started reading more widely and eclectically, and therefore my writing also became, in this imitative or derivative way, somewhat more diverse as well. So there was a Stephen Hart Crane's story about the US Civil War that kind of inspired me to imagine a civil war in an Indian context, and I wrote a slightly silly and morbid story about a father and a son, a father killing the son on the battlefield and so on. But for some reason, the Sunday edition of the Free Press Journal, which in those days was called the Bharat Jyoti, decided to publish it. So I appeared in print. I was all of 10 years old. And then an attempt at writing, so I don't know how many of you have even heard of Biggles. Biggles is this World War fighter pilot, Captain W.E. Johns, an interminable series that took him from World War I all the way up to the Cold War. But I was quite a fan of Biggles, and I invented an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot in World War II, what I thought was a fairly serious book called Operation Bellows was serialized by the Junior Statesman, whose editor, Desmond Doig, thought of my pilot's exploits as being sort of Baron Munchausen translated into the 20th century of improbable tales of daring do. And so that, the first installment of that appeared a week before my 11th birthday. And that's, so the writing for publication started then, and that I thought made all the difference.
And you say your father was the person who believed in you the most, or at least you're writing the most.
He was astonishing, yeah. He was astonishing because, frankly, you know, these asthmatic scribbles of a child could have been mildly indulged. My father decided to pay me the tribute of taking this seriously. So he got his secretary to type up the stories so I could pass them around to friends and so on. And he thought they were good enough for that to be worth his time. And once I, kept writing and kept, circulating these texts and so on, it was he inevitably who sent off the stories to magazines saying, "So what my son writes, would you be interested?" And that's where the Bharat Jyoti and then the Junior Statesman came from. And there's something terribly addictive about first seeing your name in print. When that happens, you kind of want to see it happening more often, and I decided that I could write, and I needed to write. So it was frequently you come home from school, finish your homework. If you were well enough, go and play with friends for a while, then come back and write. And it became almost a daily activity. And I don't know if that would have been possible for a child like me today when there's television and other distractions. But there weren't any other distractions, and so this is what I focused on. And that, I think, helped shape the writer in me, both because I was actually motivated to write, and because what I wrote was being read by people I could meet around me. Since these were appearing in Indian magazines, that my family's friends and my own friends read. And so I was getting feedback in real time, as it were. And that was really the shaping of me as a writer.
Sure.
It was a process of writing for publication and being read by people whose feedback you got instantly.
So you talk about your father's influence, but your mother too, who is present today, Lily Tharoor, was a huge influence on your life. Could you tell us a bit about how she pushed you towards excellence?
So Dad was very much a man of words. I mean,
Right.
he loved word games. He was a Scrabble addict. There wasn't a word game he couldn't play and excel in and enjoyed. And he imparted somewhat infectiously that love of words to the kids. My mother's was a very different story. My mother was somebody who was very driven internally and wanted to ensure that her children did all the things that she never had an opportunity to do growing up in a village in Kerala. And so she would take us off and enter us in competitions, drive us off to participate in them.
Give us some examples.
Oh, I mean, my mother was constantly taking me off to speech contests and that sort of thing. She got my sisters and me as little kids to appear on All India Radio. She used to do some programs on All India Radio and so on, and she would drive us off to do the children's equivalents thereof. She was always, in one of my books, I've dedicated it to my mother's divine discontent. She was, nothing was ever enough. She always wanted, wanted to do more and wanted us to do more. And that, I think, drove me a great deal. In many ways, the sort of restless energy that characterizes the family is partly sort of inculcated. I mean, people always assume that type A personalities are born, not made. I'm not sure. I think in some ways there's a part of me that's still happiest, sitting alone in the room, either with a book or typing at a computer screen, rather than actually having to go out and expend myself. But with my parents being the way they were, I think all three of us kids grew up into being a little more outgoing.
All right, you've gained a reputation as a user of big, unfamiliar, and often opaque sort of words.
Not fair.
But I think that's a disservice to your writing, which I find clever, lucid, very, very precise. Now, tell me what you characterize as good writing and what your advice to an aspiring young writer would be.
See, David, first of all, I think you have to ask yourself why you're writing. You're writing presumably to communicate to people. At least I am. I've never been the kind of person. I know some women, particularly, since there's an SRS program, I know some women who write rather well poetry and so on, as they say, for themselves in a little diary and shove it away in a drawer and lock it up. And I honestly don't see the point. I really think if you're writing, you should share it with others. The purpose of writing is to reach others. And these poems and diaries, you may as well keep to yourself. You can sit in the corner and think. What's the point of just hiding it away? So my view about writing is that you really need to be able to reach people, and you cannot reach people effectively if you're not understood. So I try as far as possible to use words that are appropriate to convey exactly the idea I wish to convey, but which at the same time are understood by the majority of readers. Now, I am not saying that every word I write is always understandable by anybody, because
I think you're having some fun with these sort of big words,
That's
which are
right.
not
So-
necessarily in the service of your...
But that's the second point. So the first one is that I write, as you suggested, I try to be clear, I try to communicate. But style is also part of writing. And especially, I think, even in my fiction, I've always said the tale is not as important as the telling of the tale. It has to come together. Anyone can think of a plot. Well, I shouldn't say that, many people can't. But let's assume that you can think of a plot. If you don't tell it well, then the book falls flat. And the same story or a lesser story, a less clever story, could actually be absolutely dignified by a clever or brilliant style. So to cut a long story short, style is important. And style involves all sorts of things, vocabulary, wit, the use of various formulae for effect, etc. One of the things that makes me a devotee of P.G. Wodehouse is precisely that he was a master of English prose in ways that very, very few writers have ever been. And so to me, words have a certain value as part of that process, which are not necessarily only about getting a simple message across. Now, I think what happened was I got this reputation David's referring to, in particular because of one incident when a rather egregious fellow broadcast a series of lies about me on television. I reacted in fury, saying this is a farrago of misrepresentations and outright lies, broadcast by an unprincipled showman masquerading as a journalist. Now, all of those individual words I thought were fairly simple. Farrago, for example, I'd been using in my debates in St. Stephen's College as a teenager, so I didn't think these were unknown words, but apparently they were, because a few hours later there was this mystified tweet by the Oxford English Dictionary asking why there were 1 million searches for the word farrago, obviously all from India, and so on. And suddenly this became, people started opening Twitter accounts calling themselves Mr. Farrago and all sorts of strange things. And I suddenly realized that yes, once in a while you can go wrong in assuming that a word is more commonly understood than it is. Farrago is a confused mixture for any of you who still need to know. But anyway, the point is that this particular thing then suddenly saddled me with a reputation for using unfamiliar words. And after that, I got massively caricatured. You know, there are literally hundreds of memes out there. I've mentioned some of them in the book, parodying my apparent incomprehensibility, which was certainly not my reputation. As David says, you know, I wouldn't be read as widely as I have the privilege of being read if no one could understand what I was writing. But anyway, suddenly this went up. Now, when you're ruthlessly caricatured, so you've got, I mean, there's a picture of me having a meeting with the then Home Minister Rajnath Singh, and somebody's drawn a speech bubble above his head saying, "Oh my God, I don't even have a dictionary," and things like that, you know. I mean, silly jokes like this. There was one, not too bad one, I thought, that said, "I thought I was poor. Then I met Tharoor and realized I was impecunious." You know, this sort of humor was good. There was a lot of stuff that was not so good-natured as well, but that comes with the territory. So I thought, now I'm saddled with this thing. Either I sulk and resent it and keep trying to get away from that image, or I just embrace it and try and make the best of it. And I chose that option. And so, for example, when David published my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, and Aleph asked me to tweet about it, that the book was about to be available, I thought, why not cash in on this reputation and use a word that will draw attention to the tweet and to the book? And so I wrote, my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is not just a 500-page exercise in floxinosi nihilipilification. Now, floxinosi nihilipilification is a slightly jokey word, which means the act of estimating something as worthless. So I'm saying I'm not just calling the Prime Minister worthless. I know you think that I'm opposition MP. Why would I take so many pages to say that? It is much more to it, so please read the book. That was the message. And sure enough, the word got massively looked up. It had the unintended consequence that to this day, poor little toddlers are wheeled out by their parents to recite the word floxinosi nihilipilification solemnly to me. But the fact is that that's it. Or it came in political use when a particular chief minister who had been elected as an ally of my party then defected to the opposite party that he'd campaigned against. I tweeted in a word of the day, snollygoster. Definition is shrewd, unprincipled politician. First use USA 1845, latest use in India today. I didn't name the guy, didn't name the incident, didn't name the state, but everyone knew what I was talking about. And snollygoster became slightly more popular in India, and so on. So I've done that kind of thing just for the fun of it. But you're right, it is really at bottom jokey. If I wrote sentences that nobody could understand, there wouldn't be any point.
So what would your advice to a young writer be? The one tip you would give that person?
No, the one tip that I always give every person who says they want to be a writer is to read. And the more you read, the more comfortable you get with language. First of all, the more words you know, which helps you if you want to be a writer. But also, the more comfortable you'll be with the sense of how words are used by others, how effectively they're used, and when they're ineffectively used, because not all writing is necessarily good or effective writing. So my first advice is read. And when you write to be understood. I don't go as far as Hemingway, I think, who said you write a sentence and then strike out all the adjectives. I don't believe that. Sometimes adjectives are useful, adverbs are useful, modifiers are welcome. So my style is more ornate than Hemingway's ever was, but I would say that write simply and clearly, and if you write something in a way that is unnecessarily heavy. In other words, if you're using an incomprehensible word which is not more precise or not significantly more valuable in that context than a simpler word, then use a simpler word, because ultimately you want to be understood.
All right, moving on to the second planet you inhabit, politics. You came to politics rather late in your career.
Yeah.
What made you get into politics?
Well, first of all, I had spent 29 years at the United Nations, very different world, and run for the only election I'm proud to say I've ever lost was the election to Secretary General of the UN. And that was a very small electorate, just the 15 members of the Security Council. And I didn't make it, and having not made it, though the Secretary, the winner, Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General, was gracious enough to invite me to remain, I did feel that it would probably not, on balance, be the right thing to do, that anything I said or did would just cast a shadow on either him or me. It just wasn't right. So I decided to move on. I spent about a year and a half, almost 2 years, in the private sector, sort of doing a kind of consultancy arrangement with a Dubai-based company that was looking at investments in India, and that gave me an excuse to travel to India and so on. Of course, two things I learned very quickly: that my deep fascination for what was going on in India, which I had expressed in my writings. You talked me into writing India from Midnight to the Millennium, but there was an example of the things I cared about in my own country. It was a sweeping survey of 50 years of India's independence. And so coming back to India with more time on my hands and with perhaps a little more access to people at the top was for me a confirmation that India is really, really what mattered most to me. And the other thing I discovered at the same time is that honestly, making money was never a motivation for me, had never been. I'd got into both the IIMs when I left college, but I turned them down to go off and study international relations. Just looking at things like investment and profit and so on and so forth, I mean, it just didn't move me. I mean, others are welcome to do it. I'm not knocking it. I'm in fact not at all anti what capitalists do to make the world go round, but it wasn't the thing that motivated me to wake up in the morning. So when, somewhat to my surprise, the Congress Party offered me a ticket to contest in 2009, I didn't hesitate for a minute. In fact, I didn't even ask anyone, which didn't do my then marriage any good. I just said yes, and I plunged into the maelstrom. But I can say in all truthfulness that I didn't quite know what I was plunging into. So part of the answer to your question of why did I do it was out of sheer ignorance, because I had no idea how tough it was to fight a Lok Sabha election. I had the slightly naive notion that, in fact, someone like me, who had lived abroad pretty much all his life, in fact, all my adult life, that I had to earn my credentials to represent the people by actually going out and seeking their votes and coming in with that. And believe me, it is hard work. People outside, I think, have really no idea how tough it is to be in ground level, retail level politics. And so having done that and having won the election in 2009, I found myself in this new and till then not unfamiliar world, but a world I had only known from the outside. I had written about politics. I had read about politics. I had met and talked to politicians. But I had never actually been in the process from the grassroots up. And that was really a crash course in the realities of Indian political life.
All right. You write in the book about a few of your political heroes. What was the one trait that all of them shared and that you admire?
Political heroes is a difficult word to say because, as you know from my other writings, including the Great Indian Novel, I really see all my heroes as having feet of clay.
Yeah, sure.
Nobody is a Superman in the real world, and everybody has flaws. But the book, PPP, as David and I irreverently call it, Pride, Prejudice and Punditry, has some of my writings on Nehru, Ambedkar, Patel, Krishna Menon, Tilak, quite a wide range of Indian political personalities. I would say that there were a number of things that linked them all, even if I don't agree with everything and every idea. One was certainly their passion for India, their realization and their dedication to a certain vision of a better India that they were spending their lives to serve. That's very inspiring. And the other thing is that they all were very good with words. They all wrote, they all spoke. Nehruji, of course, stands out as a writer, though Ambedkar is a pretty close second.
Gandhi.
Gandhiji in his own way. I mean, his prose is not literary the way Nehru's is.
Very clear, though.
But it's very clear, absolutely, and of a sort of transcendent simplicity and sincerity that's very difficult for people in contemporary politics to match. So these were all very, very significant traits. But I would say that the writing, the use of language to communicate their passion and their values, those are the things that really appeal to me.
You write in the book about some of the things you most despise about politics today. Talk about a few of those.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that, despise is too strong a word, but one of the things you realize about a lot of politics is that if you come in from the outside as I did with a sense of politics as being a battlefield of ideas, that is that, it's about principles and values and what you care about to project in your national interest. Plus, of course, things like development objectives, foreign policy objectives, all of these big picture things that I had read about and written about before coming into politics. The actual experience of politics is that that's a very small percentage of what occupies the mind space and the time of the average politician. And a lot of what politicians find themselves doing is attending to constituents who want a job for their son, who want a loan waiver for the last loan they took from a bank that they can't repay, who want a recommendation for something that... It's essentially a lot about personal interest. Now, things that the average Indian MP is required to do are things that many Western democratic politicians would be forbidden from doing in terms of ethics rules in their countries. In our country, we are supposed to do them. If we don't do them, we're not good politicians. And there is no question of it being unethical to call a public sector undertaking and say, please consider this candidate. I'm at least careful to say, other things being equal, and provided you don't have, please pay attention to this resume. But you have to do that, and you do. And sometimes it works, and sometimes, of course, it doesn't. But the point is that trying to look after individual interests takes up an enormous amount of time. And it becomes difficult, which is why it's not always easy for somebody, for example, somebody who's in a place like the foreign ministry, where he's going to be jetting around the world most of the time, and he will neither have the time nor the space to either attend to constituent needs or act upon them. It would be very difficult for a foreign minister to get re-elected to the Lok Sabha. I think the Prime Minister of today was very wise to name somebody to the Rajya Sabha and make him foreign minister, because he would not have been able to be a Lok Sabha MP and a foreign minister at the same time. I think that is to some degree a flaw in our system. The parliamentary system does require that of people, and the parliamentary system requires that, that you have to be an electable politician in order to adorn ministerial office. But in fact, the qualities required in ministerial office may not necessarily be the same qualities that get you elected. And those are some of the flaws in our system.
Talking of that, you write in the book about leadership, what a good leader needs to have. What would your advice be to the country's present leadership?
I'm not going to go into that, David, at this point, if you don't mind. I mean, the truth is that I think the one thing I will say about the present leadership is that it's forgotten the key lesson of inclusivity. I think that ultimately, once you become the head of a government or you become the government of a country, you have to represent all the people and not only your narrow political interests. Again, I think that's partly a flaw of the parliamentary system we have, that if you come with a particular ideology and you're spending 5 years or longer just in the relentless pursuit of the interests of that ideology, you're not actually doing good by the country. So that's another flaw, I think, in the system. But the system we have has created an opportunity for those who are in fact not inclusive, who are divisive in the pursuit of their party's interests, to be actually in charge of the machinery of government of the country. I think that's most unfortunate. But Other leadership qualities, let's talk about some other time. In fact, I've been mulling about all of what I've seen in Indian politics. There might well be one day in the remote future a book in that. But I will say that leaders need to be attentive, need to listen, need to hear, need to pay attention to people. I think leadership is not only about being the hero on the white stallion, charging down with upraised sword, saying, I know all the answers, I can solve all the problems. I mean, we've seen that at work, and it hasn't worked very well. I think that a lot of leadership is about bringing the people along and making them feel that they have actually accomplished, something you want to get done. I think there is an old Chinese verse. It's not in the book, but I can recount it from memory. It goes back to some 3rd or 4th century BC, which basically talks about kings, same as leaders, that the worst king of all is the one who's feared. The next worst is the one who is loved and seeks that love. The best of all, I'm summarizing very, very abruptly, but the best of all is the one who, when he has accomplished something, the people say, we did it ourselves. And it's a bad paraphrase, but that's the message. I think that today's leaders are the ones, the effective leaders are the ones who actually can accomplish something, and then the people will say they did it themselves. In other words, your ability to empower people and give them a stake in your achievements is what makes you a truly successful leader.
All right, so let's move on to your erstwhile career, which is diplomacy. As a top UN diplomat, you had a part to play in trying to resolve many of the world's most debilitating crises. What, in your view, is the biggest crisis facing the world today, and how would you fix it?
I think it's almost impossible to avoid the pandemic issue.
That's the immediate one, but...
Yeah, but I mean, first of all, the pandemic has also brought into play one of the larger issues of multilateralism and the way in which the world works together. Because in the COVID pandemic, we have simply not come together effectively. I mean, many of you will remember the beginning of the pandemic in January, February, March of last year, when nations were just scrambling to do things for themselves. When international cooperation abruptly ceased, Europe had spent 50 years touting their coming together as one and creating the Schengen Agreement for borderless travel. As soon as this pandemic broke out, the whole Schengen Agreement collapsed and borders came up, border controls came up between all the member countries and so on. When it came to the whole networked world, the Tom Friedman-esque world is flat arrangement, the world suddenly ceased to be flat. Again, barriers went up. Rich countries started trying to get PPE for themselves, started to get medicines for themselves, not caring about others. Airports shut down initially, trying to keep out travelers from China, then other countries which got infected. I mean, it became suddenly a very selfish dog-eat-dog world. And I wondered, having spent all these decades in the UN promoting multilateralism, what happened to that? So, though it's now finally begun to heal itself, in between we had Trump pulling out of WHO, we had the xenophobia against China initially and against Chinese people. All of this was, to me, ringing some major alarm bells. In an ideal world order situation, we would have worked together. We would have tried to collectively come to an understanding of the virus, how it happened. We would have been exchanging best practices. We'd have been cooperating to try and stop it. Instead, the way in which we reacted actually may have facilitated the uncontrolled spread of the virus. So if you really want to talk about a particular global problem, it is the lack of genuine international cooperation. It is the lack of genuine willingness to work for the interests of our common humanity, as opposed to our immediate, narrow, parochial national interests. And even now, the lessons learned seem to be one of more Atmanirbhar and more self-reliance and more exclusion of others and so on.
All right. Our time's coming to an end, Shashi. So let me quickly get you to focus on a couple of things that I would like to ask you about. The first is, one of your most successful books has been about Hinduism. On the one hand, you say Hinduism could be a universal religion for the world. On the other hand, you feel the bad side of Hinduism on display could wreck a lot of things. Could you very quickly talk about that in about 2 minutes, the difference between good and bad Hinduism?
Yeah, I've actually been talking about bits and pieces of this in a lot of my earlier books. People thought that the Why I'm a Hindu was entirely provoked by the the BJP's ascent, but in fact, I've said in 300 odd pages something that I already talked about in about 2 or 3 pages in India from Midnight to the Millennium 25 years earlier. So it's not that I'm not conscious of. I've talked about my personal Hinduism growing up. I mean, I had very devout parents. My father used to religiously pray every day after his shower. It's still a vivid recollection of him with his wet towel wrapped around himself and his wet hair still uncombed, chanting his mantras. But he never obliged me or my sisters to join him. The entire Hindu idea that he believed was you must seek your own truth. And I did, and I've gone through all the processes of doubt and incertitude and everything. And in the process of finding my own truth, or what I understood to be my truth, I realized, first of all, that Hinduism believes your truth is within yourself. You don't seek the truth outside, in the heavens. It's inside you. And I also realized that the very idea of a personal truth admits the possibility of other truths. And so Hinduism, to me, was a uniquely universal faith in that it says, essentially, that all ways of looking towards the divine are equally valid. I mean, Swami Vivekananda, in his famous address to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, 1893, he talked about the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which says that just as many rivers can flow some straight, some crooked in different directions and end up in the same sea, so also, from the Hindu point of view, all ways of worship end up at the same divine. And that idea, to me, was deeply compelling. I read a lot of Vivekananda in my late teens and became totally convinced intellectually about the value of this way of doing it. And this notion that it is not just tolerance, but acceptance of difference that keeps us going, that we work with that again made it a very good faith to have in a multi-religious world and a multi-religious society like India, but also then later in a multi-religious environment like the United Nations. And so my conviction, my faith was very much in that. And therefore, it's a faith very much for a world of inclusion, of diversity, of pluralism. It is also, interestingly enough, a very suitable faith for an era of doubt and uncertainty. If you go to the Nasadya Sukta, the very first creation verse in the Rig Veda, it says, so where did this world come from? Who created it? What is it made of? Only he in the heaven knows. Or maybe even he does not know. Can you imagine? And there is no faith in the world that expresses doubt about the omniscience of the Creator, if there is a Creator. But Hinduism says even that is a question of doubt. You have to explore, you have to debate, you have to understand. So that, to my mind, is what makes me a Hindu, and that's what I talk about. Now, contrast that with the political Hinduism of the Hindutva movement, and that I'm deeply troubled by. These people have reduced the soaring majesty of the Vedas, of the Upanishads, of the Vedanta, into literally something like the team identity of the British football hooligan. This is my team, and if you're supporting the other team, I'm going to hit you on the head. That is not Hinduism. Hindutva is the fundamentally most un-Hindu set of beliefs and practices that you can imagine, and they've called themselves Hindutva, which means Hindu-ness. It's an absolute travesty, because this whole notion of taking this faith and reducing it to a badge of cultural identity, to my mind, is to diminish something far greater than the proponents of this kind of thinking can ever understand. So that was what my books on Hinduism were all about, and you've taken some excerpts in this volume as well. But I would say to all of you that to my mind, religion and politics really ought to be kept separate. I think politics is about how you create a better life for people in today's world. And religion is about how you figure out your relationship with the cosmic forces, the divine forces, with creation, with life beyond life, all of those big issues. And the two really have nothing in common. They do not occupy the same space, and they should not. The moment you take your way of religion and make it into a political team identity cause, you are doing a great disservice both to politics and to religion.
Okay, one last thing, which is not a question. Few people know that Shashi is actually a good poet. why don't you read one of your poems to the audience?
Oh, David, you've done me a bit of a disservice here because I
No, you read
wasn't
well,
prepared.
you write good poetry. Where's the harm?
All right, I'll read you. Let's see now. I know what you want me
Yes,
to read.
I want you to read it because I think it will strike a chord.
All right, since I'm sure that I'm going to regret this choice later, but anyway.
Well, you put it in the book. You know?
All right, I have two short poems, well, one slightly shorter than the other, which, for lack of a better term, I've called two love poems. One was written a few weeks, months after the tragic and premature passing of my wife, and it's called For Sunanda Now Gone. And it tried to capture something of what she meant to me in our tragically short marriage. Sequin saris and swirling Peshawari's, lehengas and blue jeans too, designer dresses with sparkling zaris, they all remind me of you. Kashmiri wazwans, reclining divans, mountains that sparkle with dew, army officers and their loyal jawans, they all remind me of you. Lyrics in Hindi, stick-on bindi, movies seen by all or a few, songs recited from Pune to Pindi, they all remind me of you. Raucous laughter now and hereafter, pink champagne out of the blue, French jokes, daft and some even dafter, all remind me of you. Multiple pillows, seats next to windows, airplanes and airports so new, tickets and trolleys, business class rows, always remind me of you. The rustle of sheets, a drummer's beats, a dance in the dark or two, rousing applause for a movie star's feats, they all remind me of you. Tears in the night, rage that takes flight, tantrums that drown out, please sue, kind words and kisses that dispel my fright, they all remind me of you. Now you are gone and I am forlorn, sometimes I'm down and quite blue. The darkness won't fade when light comes at dawn, for it all reminds me of you. But when rain comes or shine or wet or fine, I imagine what's false and so true. I sigh and I pine, I miss what was mine. The world reminds me of you. Actually, even reading it aloud, I realized, every single image or reference is something that actually only meant something to the two of us. So if it had to be annotated, the annotations would take pages because each of those actually relates to something that relates to something she did or used or felt or experiences we shared together. So here's a different one, which is actually based on a Neruda poem. Actually, the title is based on a Neruda poem because he wrote a famous poem called I Do Not Love You. And I took that concept, but I wrote a very different poem. I do not love you. I do not love you as the jeweler loves the glitter of gold, or the designer the elegance of the sari fold. I do not love you as the politician loves a vote, or the water loves the caress of the gliding boat. I do not love you as the flame adores the wicked devours, or as the ticking clock consumes the passing hours. No, I love you as certain secret things are treasured whole, in private, between the dark shadow and the glowing soul. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Shashi. That is splendid. Thank you.
I would have preferred to read something more cheerful. I've written some funny verses, but they're not in the book. So given the ones that are there, which are varying degrees of grimness, I suppose this is the one.
Very lovely.
All right.
Sadly, this session has to end, and we have all been a part of this absolutely new face of Shashi Tharoor. And of all the faces that you have shown to us, Shashi, this one has driven a stake into our heart.
Thank you.
I salute to your power and your words. I know, I haven't finished. David's questions and Shashi's word wizardry never disappoints. And I now throw the floor open to the audience for questions and answers.
Is there a mic going around or something? No one has any questions? Oh, Shazia.
So, sorry to kill the poignant romantic mood. So in terms of historiography, as an Indian Muslim, I mean, I can happily admit that there are good Muslim rulers and there are genocidal bigots, Khilji, Aurangzeb and all. But I mean, do we really have to sugarcoat our history, to pander to the electoral sentiments? That's one. And doesn't
So just repeat that phrase again. Do we have to pander?
Sugarcoat. Do we have to sugarcoat history to pander to the electoral sentiments? And doesn't this lack of nuance and the need to justify the unjustifiable clump together good rulers like Akbar with them and perpetuate the black and white, And the problem is also when your party, because we did mention BJP, so I feel the need to mention the Congress party. So a bit of tit for tat for there. Promotes Marxist historians who do this. It is average Muslims like us, who have to pick up the tab. Because there are a large majority of us, assimilated, syncretic, believers of syncretic India, with the regressive fundamentalist majority. And that is hugely problematic. Also, if the dropout rate of Muslim girls in the last 8 years in the primary and secondary schools has dropped from 70% to 40%. Which
You mean during the COVID pandemic or?
No, during the last 7 years.
7 years. Mm.
So is that not a sign of inclusivity? That's one. And also I want to ask the real minority within the minority, the Muslim women, when they denied the basic right to dignity, not being abandoned and thrown on the streets, and parties who claim to be secular and inclusive, is it not shameful that they don't really come to their aid, in fact speak against them, and work against a law that would actually help and provide succor to their ailing lives?
Okay, Shazi. Well, on all of those, I think you'll be surprised perhaps that I agree with you more than disagree. Number one, no, we should not sugarcoat history. We should allow historians to dig up facts and to write their own analyses, and we should have the education and the capacity to judge from those analyses. So, for example, I think in Why I'm a Hindu, or perhaps in the Hindu Way, there are a couple of paragraphs about the Muslim invasions and the fact not only that they did a significant amount of damage. I don't mean okay, let me clarify my vocabulary. I draw a distinction between those who came from outside, attacked, looted, pillaged, and went back, and those who came and stayed and immersed themselves and their bloodlines in this soil. For me, these are two different categories of people. But on the former, they did do a great deal of damage, and in many ways, they also provoked a reaction in Hindu society that was in many ways regressive for Hindu society as well. A lot of the practices of North Indian Hindus were a direct result of having to respond to the threat and the ever-present fear of being attacked by these raiders from across the mountains. So this was a genuine thing, and I've talked about it openly, and I've been attacked for it as well by some whom I would normally have thought of as being on my side of these debates. So I agree with you. No sugarcoating, face up to the facts. So I would say all the bad things that you say happened, may have happened, probably did happen, but today's Muslims should not be paying the price for that.
Exactly.
And we should not. That's my point. And I've been saying this since the moment of the Babri Masjid demolition, indeed from the campaign that led to it. On your second point, as far as the question of women are concerned, I genuinely believe with a great deal of passion that in fact a society should be judged by the progress and empowerment of its women. As a UN official, I've written an article about 20 odd years ago saying that if I was asked to name one sort of magic bullet, there isn't one for development or anything else, it would probably be educate girls. Sure. Because there's so many studies that establish that educating girls is what transforms communities and societies for the better. At all levels, even down to demography, to population reproduction, everything, sanitation, all sorts of things get improved when girls are educated. Now, when you look at Kerala, for example, one of the great accomplishments of Kerala's Muslim community is that it is perhaps the only state in India where there is absolutely no gender difference between Muslim women and Muslim men, and between Muslim women and Hindu or non-Muslim women, in terms of literacy, education attainments, and so on. Because from a very early stage, I mean, early by Indian standards, that is from the late 60s onwards, the principal Muslim political parties fought for the inclusion, education, and empowerment of women from their communities. And as a result, now in the last 30, 40 years, we're talking, for example, of the Muslim League Party, which had the education portfolio whenever they were part of the ruling government. They made it a point to ensure that Muslim girls were educated. Now, that's not true comparably in other parts of India. So why is it...
Conversely, Shashi, don't mind if I correct you, it is because of Wahhabism and the rise of Wahhabism in Kerala, there's so many more women who cover their heads, and this kind of ritual burqaization was not there earlier. That's one. Two, I mean, for the life of me, I don't get it as to why I did not learn in any of my history books about Nalanda University being burnt, the question that Vikram Sampath brought to you. Nalanda University and Bakhtiyarpur being named Bakhtiyarpur and still being there. That. And the third point that I wish to make is, how is giving in to All India Muslim Personal Law Board a set of regressive, self-appointed, self-anointed clergy inclusive in any way whatsoever? But just because they're vote brokers?
Shazi, you're not criticizing me. I've written about each of these things. I've written about Nalanda University. It's in my book, India Shastra, a longish essay, including Bakhtiyar Khilji's raid and the destruction of Nalanda University. I was a critic of the Shah Banu and the whole issue then, and the government's action at that time. And you'll find it in India from midnight to the millennium. I mean, I'm sorry to say, as David points out, I've been writing for 40 years and publishing these books. The paper trail is as long as your arm. I cannot hide what I have always stood for and believed in, and I've believed very much in. To me, I'm sorry, as a sort of liberal Indian, I would not have wanted the Shah Banu case to be dealt with the way it was dealt with by the government. Similarly, I would not have wanted Nalanda University, which was principally Buddhist in orientation, to be destroyed by Bakhtiyar Khilji and his marauders. You know, it had the world's first 9-story library. 9 stories. We're talking about the 7th century AD, destroyed. So all of this, but just to finish, Shazia, on the question of empowering women, therefore, I'm entirely with you. But I think your last comment about the party was by implication on our opposition to the Triple Talaq law. And if that's what it was, let me say very clearly, the Triple Talaq law, in my view, was not about Muslim women. It was a way of bashing Muslim men. Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. The Triple Talaq was already illegal. It had already been declared illegal by the Supreme Court. Therefore, it could not be practiced without attracting penalty of law.
So, Shashi, can we move on to the next question? Archana.
Shashi,
I'll tell you afterwards.
Shashi,
go ahead.
After that very, very heavy question, I'm going to ask you a very light one. There's so many facets to your personality. You're a politician, an author, a diplomat, a singer also, I think. So if you had to describe yourself in one trait that runs through all, what would it be? And my second part is that since you sing so beautifully, can you sing 2 lines for us too?
Yes.
Can we have a huge applause for that, because Shashi is going to sing for us after he says that.
Listen, this is a book, right?
So
Poetry I had to surrender to, but honestly, singing...
You've done it before.
There's no podcast version yet.
So we can be a privileged audience. So first, common trait which runs through all.
No, but I would say I'm a human being with a number of responses to the world, some of which I manifest through my actions and my deeds, and some of which I manifest through my writing. So all of this comes into that. So in other words, my writing is a way of responding to the world. My politics is a way of responding to the world I see around me. and my activities in every domain are very much a reaction to the world I see around me and the way in which I'd like to see that world evolve. So just an ordinary human being, Archana.
Is there anybody else? Because I...
No, not a couple.
There's a question back.
Spain. Maybe at the very end. I'll come to the corner and see.
The two questions back.
And then we have somebody at the back.
The hands at the back, yeah. Yes.
Nidhi.
Hi. Hi, Shashiji. This side. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Of all the books, all the 20 books that you have written, someone who has not read you, what is the first book that you would recommend to start someone reading you?
I always say this is like asking a mother, which is your favorite child? You know,
No, someone who,
you
who
put-
wants
you-
to start reading you.
You put all of yourself into each of your books, and for me, each of them honestly is of equal value. But I would say the answer depends on the reader. What is your area of interest? Because they're very, very different. Each of my 3 novels is very different from each other. Each of my non-fiction books deals with a different subject. So, for example, if you were interested in cricket, there's only one book, which is my co-authored book with Shahryar Khan on Indo-Pakistan cricket. If you're interested in reading about literature, then Booklist in Baghdad is the book for you. If you like biographies, I'm very proud of my biography of Nehru, which is, has the great merit of brevity, because all the good books on Nehru are sort of hundreds of pages in multiple volumes. And here you've gotten 200 odd pages, really all the essential details of his life and his legacy. So I feel I've done a good job of distillation in that as well. And so on and so forth. If you want to get into history, get into the arguments about colonialism, I would recommend An Era of Darkness. If you are prepared to grapple with some heavy theorizing and then relating to contemporary politics, the whole issue of nationalism has been dealt with pretty heftily in the Battle of Belonging. And I hope it rewards careful and patient reading. And so on and so forth it goes. So in some ways, David's book, this book is the simplest answer to your question, because it includes a tasting, as it were, of every one of my different kinds of writing. And you can actually, by reading this book from cover to cover, you can decide which ones you want to read more fully.
Thank you so much.
In
I
other
thought
words-
I have to read all of them. Thank you.
In other words, Nidhi,
In other words,
there's
read this
no
book.
shortcut.
Read this book.
Start alphabetically and go all the way through. There's somebody at the back who wanted to ask something. Yes,
Someone
please.
there.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, Mr. Tharoor. Good evening.
Hi. The masked marvel, I have no idea who you are. Tell us
I
who you
thought I'm going to use this, so I might as well just, yeah. So in your book, I sort of skimmed through the book, and you touched upon Modi and Vallabhbhai Patel's. You were drawing a sort of comparison, or you said that Modi was trying to compare himself to Patel in some ways. And you talked about Gandhian morals, how Patel stood up to that. And in another chapter, you also touched upon the whole event that happened between Ambedkar and Gandhi when it came to a separate electoral process. And as you just mentioned that we don't need to sugarcoat history. We need to sort of dig up all these things. Do you think that there needs to be a rereading of Gandhi's life? Because from what I've read of Ambedkar, from his writings, I've sort of realized that he really didn't like Gandhi, and he has quite strong points for that. I don't want to say that out loud, but I'm sure you must have glossed over them as well. So I wanted to ask if we need to also question the image of Gandhi that we have today, and as you said in the beginning, you sort of you consider all your heroes to have flaws, to be flawed in some way, to have feet of clay. So is this a good time? Maybe would you also sort of write a book, or maybe write an article sort of exposing?
I'm actually planning to write a book on Ambedkar. Again, trying to replicate the brevity of my Nehru book and try to understand his life and legacy. I would say that as far as Gandhiji is concerned, there are literally multiple views of his life already. And there are probably 1,000 different books by different writers on what Gandhiji stood for, believed, various aspects of his behavior, his convictions, his politics. You know, the interesting thing about history is that it's constantly being reinterpreted. We know things about Gandhiji's life that were not talked about at all till the 70s. Equally, we know we're discovering things about other people's attitudes to Gandhiji that perhaps we were not aware of at a time when he was just being worshipped uncritically. At the same time, there's absolutely no sort of diminishing the magnitude of his life and achievement as well, in my view. So what you need to do at any stage in history is to actually relate to people from the past from the point of view of your own perspective of today, but acknowledge that it is your today's perspective. You see, ultimately all human beings act in the context of their own historical circumstances. And what seems to us transcendently wrong, for example, today, may not have struck anybody as being wrong or inappropriate at the time in which they were done. And that's why I think it's important for us. I talked about British colonialism, and I said in many speeches about the book that the reason to know about the past is if we don't understand where we've come from, how will we appreciate where we are going? And it is more for the understanding. I accept totally that my today pointing out the various iniquities and injustices of the British in India will not change anything about the past. And even if I change some people's understanding, that is a relatively insignificant contribution to make, because what the British did is something we're all living with and we are all the products of, directly, indirectly. Even the language in which I'm speaking to you now, it might not have been our language if that was not the historical experience of our country. So you can't rewrite or reinvent the past. You certainly can't relive the past. What you can do is seek to understand the past. That's something, unfortunately, that some of our current ruling establishment don't always seem to appreciate, and that people around there are very often trying to use history as a battle axe to hit today's people with. And I don't see the point of that, because the past is the past. But I do see the point of trying to understand the past and coming to terms with it. That's a different issue. So when it comes to individuals, I think, you know, frankly, the RSS view of Gandhiji during his lifetime, at the time of his death and after his death, has been evolving. And today, the way in which the products of the RSS are speaking about Gandhiji with reverence and respect is completely at odds with the way in which they were taught to think of him when they were growing up. As it were. So opinions shift, historical context change, political context change. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, I'm sorry to say.
Any other questions? Yeah, please, go ahead. Will you give her a mic, please?
I think the person could stand up or something so the mic person knows where to go.
Yeah.
Hello, Milan.
Okay.
Go ahead.
My question has to
Milan
do
is
with
the High Commissioner of Sri Lanka.
Shashi Tharoor, the retail politician, because you expressed dislike is a strong word, discomfort with the patronage requirements of politics in South Asia as a whole. Even in our country, it is the same, the expectations of an MP. But you have been re-elected. So that means you have done something right, you have connected.
Absolutely.
So could you elaborate on that? I mean, is there another route outside of patronage politics, or is it that you actually excelled at that as well as excelling at everything else?
You know, Milan, it's an interesting question, because you are also a politician, so you know what I'm talking about. Ultimately, you may have a lot of contributions you can make to your country, but your survival as an elected politician will depend on your ability to convince the people who voted for you that you have served them well. That is ultimately the truth in any democracy. And in my case, see, unlike the American system where the cabinet consists of people who are not elected, who are only there because of their ability to perform those portfolios, whereas the elected people are in the business of passing laws and policies and budgets and doing the legislative work. I actually find that conceptually a superior idea. Separate the legislature from the executive. But the parliamentary system, which is a British perversion we've been saddled with, has created a situation where people are elected to the legislature, not really to legislate, but to form the executive. And once the executive is formed, the government has a reliable majority to rubber stamp everything it wants to put forward. In India in particular, I don't think you have this in Sri Lanka, but we do, we have an anti-defection law, which makes it impossible for any legislator to vote his conscience. If he disagrees with his party, he has no choice but to go along with the party whip, for the simple reason that if not, under the anti-defection law, he can be expelled not only from the party, but from the house that he was so painstakingly elected to. So, I mean, we've got in many ways a flawed system for all of these reasons. But coming back to your question, yes, I've been re-elected twice, 3 times now I've been coming to Parliament, and it's because indeed I have had to spend a lot of time paying attention to the needs of my constituents, and that includes obviously not just the things I mentioned, but also development issues. Particularly, I've been able to break some logjams in government and see them through on the ground, particularly a major highway which will be transformative for people and for generations yet to come in a particular part of my constituency, hospitals, stoppages of railway trains, all sorts of things that will actually affect the daily lives of the people whose votes I then have to seek. So this is how these things work. And of course, if people have, shall we say, are caught up in a particular wave of either hostility towards you or your party, or sympathy for somebody else and support for somebody else, then you could still falter. But if you haven't done these basic things, then you're not going to be able to come back. So that's I think, the sort of short answer to your concern.
We have time for just one question.
And
before I tell you to ask your question, with your permission, David, I hijack one of your questions to answer what Shashi said. What is the advice you would give to a young writer? Well, I told my 4-year-old grandson कि अगर बड़ा writer बनना है तो Tharoors खरीदो और पढ़ो और रोज एक word याद करो. So by the time you come of age, you will become a Shashi Tharoor. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. My question to you is with regards to your writing process, the technique of your writing. In between your commitments, is there a particular time in the day that you dedicate to your writing? Do you revisit what you write? And secondly, was there a section in this particular book which was particularly challenging for you? If yes, then which one was it and why?
So I'm not quite sure I heard that second part, did you?
The second part was about...
Is there a section of the book?
Process that was particularly difficult for you to put together? If so, what was it?
Oh, I think the poetry is the answer to that second part. But anyway, no, let's come back to the first. The thing is that, that this has been the biggest challenge for me throughout my writing life, in that I've always had a full-time job. And so you write when you can, and it always comes at the expense of your personal life, your friendships, your entertainment, etc. But in politics, there is no time you set aside really for your personal life. Politics is 24/7. Constituents can call upon you, party workers can call upon you, and party leaders can call you. Issues can come up at any time of the day or night. So in practice, what has happened in the last 13 years that I've been in politics is that I write usually when most of the people who could bother me during the day are asleep. So I get a chance to write after about 11 o'clock at night. And that has not been terribly good for my health, I'm sorry to say, or my regular regime. And that's been a challenge, because very often, A, you may be too tired to write well or feel like writing. And B, you may actually have work left over that is more urgent, maybe not as important as what you want to write, but that is more urgent and needs to be done before you go to bed. And so that comes into your post-11 o'clock time, and then you don't end up doing any writing. It's one of the reasons, for example, I said this to David when he wrote the introduction to this book, that my fiction has fallen off, because I started off as a fiction writer, and I actually enjoyed that much more, and I wrote 3 novels and a collection of short stories. 4 of my first 5 volumes were fiction. And then there hasn't been one, and I've now got 23 books, and the rest of them have all been non-fiction. And if you ask me why, it's partially because with fiction, you need not just time, which is scarce enough, but you need a space inside your head to create an alternative universe. and to populate it with characters and incidents and people and dialogue and issues which are as real to you as what you're encountering in your daily life. Now, that kind of thing is possible for a full-time writer. It is difficult for a part-time writer. It is impossible for a politician. Because in the few years after my last novel, Riot, my laptop became littered with half-begun manuscripts, because it's like constructing this palace of illusions, this fake world, which is made of glass, so you can look into it periodically and look out from it. And if you suddenly find yourself interrupted by some major crisis, and you go off to attend to that, and you come back 3 weeks later, that glass is shattered, or there are cracks in the facade, very difficult to rebuild it again. And this is why I've found all my best intentions of writing novels have suffered. I used to joke to interviewers that maybe one day the voters will return me to the world of literature. But at some point I may make that choice myself. I really do. I don't want only to be remembered for books which in recent years have become increasingly political. Rather, I'd like to go back to some of my concerns. I've always felt that with fiction you can reach, like that beer commercial used to say, you can reach parts that other kinds of writing can't reach. You can touch readers in ways that non-fiction can't quite achieve. So I'd like to do that. But otherwise, you know, the short answer for anyone like me is write when you can. It's completely unpredictable. They'll be very, very rare. I mean, the one exception when I actually carved out some time was for an era of darkness, because I had assembled a lot of research, which was, you know, thousands of pages on my laptop. And I knew there was no way I could write this book without digesting all that and distilling something out. So I disappeared for 2 weeks to the mountains of Bhutan. His Majesty very kindly lent me one of his, he calls it a cottage, but it was really a mini palace. And my Indian phone wouldn't work there. No one could bother me there. I just told my staff, you know, if there is a crisis, deal with it, because I'm not going to be around for 2 weeks. And it was actually coming and going 12 weeks. It was actually 12 days. But in 12 days, I wrote 18 hours every single day. And though I didn't write the whole book, what I did was I wrote a first draft that in the end was about half the book in terms of length, but which basically broke the back of how I was going to deal with that research, how the argument would evolve. I sent it off to David. He was happy. And then when I came back to my normal life, I kept doing additional research and filling in all the gaps I wanted to fill. So what I sent him was, I can't remember now, but let's say 5 chapters and, I don't know, 50,000 words. By the time the book was finished, it was perhaps 8 chapters and maybe 100,000 words, 120,000 words. But I was able to do that because I'd finally sort of broken the back of everything, got the argument out and got the structure out. But nowadays, I don't even know when I can get that 2-week stretch very easily. And that is something that I have a challenge in doing. Sorry about the very lengthy answer, but that's about the process. On your second question, no, to be honest, despite David's kind words, I didn't think of myself as a poet. I enjoyed writing sort of light-hearted verse. So in the Great Indian novel and in show business, there's some doggerel or limerick, so slightly jokey verse, which served a particular literary purpose. In the Great Indian novel, it served 2 purposes. You know, the Great Indian novel is a retelling of the Mahabharata as a 20th century epic about the freedom struggle. And the Mahabharata is actually a poem. I don't know how many people realize this. It is the longest poem in the world, 5 times the length of the Bible. It is not prose. But obviously, most of the translations that exist are prose. And one translator, or transcreator as he called himself, P. Lal, decided to deal with this by translating the Mahabharata into prose, but occasionally breaking into verse to convey something of the poetic quality of the original. So in the Great Indian novel, I've done the same thing. I've broken into verse, partially to convey some of that poetic, but partially to arrange certain transitions, because you're dealing often with rather serious issues in a light-hearted, satirical vein. You need some light relief to get into, segue into the next thing. And so that's how it worked. Everyone seemed to like that. That worked rather well. So then my next novel, Show Business, was a satire on Bollywood. And so I had lots of very humorous verses parodying Hindi movie lyrics, perhaps unfairly, as some critics in India thought, but anyway, that was there. And then Riots, my third and so far last novel, is a more serious work. And so there are a couple of serious poems there, one of which has been selected here, because two of the characters were having a relationship in that novel, exchange poems with each other and so on, and so these are there. And so I've tried to do that really for my own pleasure and satisfaction. The only thing I ever wrote that I didn't intend to publish were some of these personal poems for really about and for specific individuals. And I hesitated whether to publish them. For example, there's a poem here that means more to me for its content than for the quality of the poetry, and it's called New Year's Wishes to My Sons. And I would welcome you all to read it, because it was a way of sort of conveying to my children what I wished for them. That New Year and every New Year in future, if you like. And so to me, that really mattered to me, and it wasn't necessary. But then I happened to be staying somewhere at the time that I'd written it, and people wanted me to read something out at that particular place. It was an Ayurvedic clinic, but there you are on New Year's Eve. So I read this New Year's Wishes, and people liked it very much. I thought, why not circulate it? And then I thought, if I'm circulating it, may as well put it in the book. So it's in the book. But the fact is that I still don't think of myself as a poet. And I remember David telling me when I recommended some poet friend to him, he said, I can't publish poetry because there's no money in it. It's not a viable form of literary activity. So it's not something which publishers are terribly interested in having. But there is some there, and that would probably therefore be the most challenging or difficult section of the book for me to have chosen and put in. I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions. Much I would like to say to Shashi ki aaj jaane ki zid na karo. We really have to end. Can I ask Ina Puri, Ehsas woman of Gurugram, to come up on stage and say the vote of thanks.
On behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation, I would like to thank Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Mr. David Davidar for such an engaging, thought-provoking conversation. I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Sri Cement Limited, Aleph Book Company, and ITC Moria for their generous support. Last but not the least, a big shout out to the wonderful, receptive audience, without whose support this evening would not have been such a success. You can buy Pride, Prejudice, and Panditry this evening at a special 40% discount from the counter outside, and have Dr. Tharoor sign the book for you. Stay well, stay safe. Thank you.
Should I stay here to sign, or are you going to?
You'll ask the question. I mean, you could stay here, but then they'd have to wind their way.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Ila, where do I sign?
Ina?
Where do I sign? Maybe you could tell them where I should. Will I be sitting here or stay here? No, I've had more than enough tea. You prefer me to stay?
कटार सजनी चैन पावे न मनवा मार सजनी चैन पावे न मनवा मार सजनी तोर नैना नैना रे तोर